Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Reaper Minis TV. We have a whole bunch of reviews to get to this time, starting off with several blisters from the Dark Heaven Legends line. In this first pack you get 4 goblins, 2 with spears and 2 with hand weapons and shields, and each of them needed a little bit of cleaning around the bottom of the base. There was some flash there, and each of them had faint mold lines in a couple places on the model, so you'll spend a couple minutes cleaning these guys up before they're ready to prime and paint. You could put them on 20mm bases with no problem at all, and they'd be highly usable in a Warlord army as goblins if you wanted to put them on 25mm bases, or in a Warhammer Fantasy Battles army if you were going to put them on 20s. They'd work fine either way, and of course they'd be fine as goblins in a fantasy RPG. They do have a slightly different look than the Pathfinder goblins, so you're probably not going to be mixing them in with a unit of those, but they do look fine on their own. They have wide mouths with a very toothy grin to them, and they have sort of a wiry or gangly and mischievous look to them, so perfect as goblins. Next up is a barbarian hero, and he's wearing a combination of furs and leather armor and scale armor. He carries a large axe in 2 hands and has several pouches on his belt, mostly on the rear section of the model. The only flesh showing is on his arms, hands, and face, but the muscle detail is all very well done. The hair is extremely well done. It's very fine sculpting there down to what look like individual strands of hair. I really only found 1 mold line on the model, and that was on the left pant leg, and there were just a couple of tiny bits of flash here and there on the model, but cleanup was relatively simple. You could get him to fit on a 1-inch base if you put him on it diagonally and did a little bit of clipping on the integrated base that he comes on. My only issue with the figure was the axe was bent in the blister pack, and it was bent right above the upper hand, and it was at such an angle to where I was actually a little bit afraid to put it back in place, and I think I probably weakened the joint by doing so. So I expect I might be doing a conversion on the model, but he will probably end up in a Warriors of Chaos army for me. Next up is Hanseth Dimgard. He's a cleric, and as you can see he's wearing a long hooded cloak that covers almost all of the model. From the back it's pretty much completely covered except for his mace that is sticking out that he's holding in his right hand, and from the front you can see part of his face from under the cloak. You can see his eyes and 1 cheek and his nose, so there's really not a whole lot of flesh to paint on the model except a little bit of face and his right hand. And from the front you can see that he's wearing plate armor underneath the large cloak. There's a little clasp on the front of the cloak that has a skull sculpted on it, so I'm thinking either of using him as an evil cleric in a D&D encounter or as the leader of a group of cultists maybe in a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay encounter. But if you wanted to, you could very easily shave off the little skull icon that's on the clasp and use him just as a good or neutral cleric if you didn't want the skull there. There were a couple of tiny bits of flash here and there on the model, but I couldn't find a mold line on the model, so he'll clean up very quickly and be ready to paint in no time. Okay, now we have a pack of 3 zombies, and they're all sculpted to look like they've had their flesh and their clothes torn up in combat and they've risen from the dead. They all look like they're sort of shambling forward, but I don't know if it's just me, but in the way that they're posed, they remind me a lot of the zombies in Michael Jackson's Thriller video, so I'm dating myself a little bit there, but they just remind me of that. They each had a few faint mold lines here and there, but they cleaned up relatively quickly, and whether you need them for a fantasy, modern, or even some kind of sci-fi zombie holocaust, these would fit in with probably any other zombies you already have. Last of the Dark Heaven Legends line for this time around is a Dragon Man. His name is Kesh Blackscale, and if he looks familiar to Warlord players out there, that's because he comes from the Gan Hor line of warriors for the Reptus army. He comes in 3 pieces, the main body with the arms and spear attached, and then the 2 wings are separate pieces that glue into place on his back. They fit perfectly into the notches that were sculpted for them on the back of the model. He's sculpted in a good fighting pose with the spear out sort of in an at-ready position. The base is wide enough and the front of the model is heavy or substantial enough to where when the wings are glued on, it's not really back heavy, so it's probably not going to fall over a whole lot on you, if at all. I did have to spend a couple of minutes cleaning the model. There were some mold lines on the wings and under his chin over on the left-hand side between like his head and his arm, and there were also a couple of bits of flash here and there on the model. We have 1 Warlord miniature to look at for this episode, and this is a Knoll Raider. It's from one of the new armies in the Savage North expansion for Warlord, and it comes in 2 pieces. The left arm and shield are a separate piece that glues on right at the elbow. It fits in perfectly at the joint there without any problem at all. There was a little bit of cleaning needed on the shield where it was cast, but really nothing unusual. From the inside you can see that it's a wooden shield, but a nice detail is that on the outside it has hides that are stitched together to form sort of a covering over it. He's carrying a spear up in his right hand, and there were some mold lines that needed to be cleaned there, but overall it's a fine Knoll figure figure that would work great in D&D or in a Warlord army. Okay everybody, we're going to get back into learning how to play Warlord and back into actions. We're going to start looking at combat actions now, and the first one is going to be a shoot action. A combat action can be either a fight action, hand-to-hand fighting, a shoot action where you'd use a bow or a crossbow or a sling or something like that to attack your enemy at range, or a spell casting action where you would, as you guessed it, try to cast a spell. So we're going to get into shooting, and the best way to do that is to jump into the action of a fight that's already in progress. For this example, I have some of my Reaper cavemen that I'm going to be using as bull orc archers, and they're going to be taking aim at Kagunk. He's an ogre captain, and technically they're all models from my Revan armies, but we're just using them here to illustrate shooting. To perform a shoot action, first you have to be able to, and that means that you have an RAV and a number of ranged attacks rating on the model's data card. In the Bull Orc Archer case, we obviously do. You also cannot be in hand-to-hand with an enemy if you want to make a shoot action. You have to be within the maximum range of the weapon you're using. In this case, their range is 12/18. That means they can shoot out to 12 inches with no penalty and up to 18 inches with a -1 penalty to their attack roll. And lastly, you have to have line of sight to the target. You can't shoot through walls or through buildings or anything like that. Okay, so now that we've established we're allowed to shoot at the ogre, we start the actual resolution stage of the combat. We start off by declaring our targets, and each of the cavemen declares that they're going to shoot at Kagunk the ogre. Then we determine if any situational modifiers apply. You get a -1 to your roll if you're in extended range. That would be if they're beyond 12 for these shots, but still under 18 inches. If your target is flying, you take a -1. If your target's in cover, you're -2 to hit them. If they're shaken, you're +2 to hit them, and if you use a focus action, you're a +1 to hit them. So if I had used a focus action, then shot, I'd be getting a bonus of +1 to hit in this case. But we didn't, so this is just going to be a straight D10 roll plus the RAV of the models that are shooting. Next, the defender is going to declare what his defensive value is. This is the target number that we're going to try to roll to hit when we're attacking. In Kagunk's case, it is a 12 that we're shooting for. Each Bull Orc Archer, or Caveman for today, has one ranged attack, so we're going to roll 1d10 for each one of them, adding 4 to the result for their RAV, and what we're trying to do is get a 12 or better on the rolls. And when we take a look at our rolls, we see we have a 9, an 8, a 1, a 3, and a 1. If we had other models in this troop taking ranged combat actions, we would resolve them now. And then before we apply damage, the defender gets a chance to take any defensive shots that they're allowed to do. The criteria to be able to take a defensive shot is the same as if you were going to take a regular combat action to shoot with. In Kagunk's case, he has no RAV because he has no ranged combat weapons, so he gets no defensive shots, and then we go ahead and apply damage. When we add 4 to each one of our rolls, we see that we have a 13, a 12, a 5, a 7, and a 5. The 12 and 13 equal or exceed Kagunk's defensive value, so he's going to take 2 wounds. We're going to mark 2 sections off of his damage track, and not only is Kagunk going to be reduced in his effectiveness a little bit, he's also 1 wound away from getting pulled from the battle. When you're playing the game, there's 2 things you want to always remember. One is that a 10 is an auto success, so even if Kagunk had a 20 defensive value, there's nobody in the game with a 20, but even if he did, a 10 on the to-hit roll is always going to succeed. That always gives you some chance of success, and you're never going to be facing somebody that you have no way of hurting whatsoever. It might be a slim chance, but you have a chance. The other thing is always remember your special abilities. The Bull Orc Archers have the Pierce ability when using their ranged attacks. And what the Pierce ability does, if your attack roll is at least 3 higher than was needed, so if it's at least 3 higher than the 12 we needed to hit Kagunk, which is a 15, then they would cause an extra point of damage. But in this example, with their base RAV of 4 and the max you can roll on a d10 being a 10, they can only hit a 14 before they need to start looking for some extra modifiers. Had they used a focus action, they could have gotten a +1 on their attack roll, but they would still need to max out on the d10 to get to the 15 to do the extra damage. But now that Kagunk has taken 2 hits, his DV is down to 11, which means he's going to be susceptible to further damage a little more easily. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode of Reaper Minis TV.